Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here with Onar, and we are going to be discussing the dim hypothesis in relation to Ayn Rand's philosophy and different ways of protecting her philosophy and conceptions of protection and how the dim hypothesis would have helped in that. Do I give a fair assessment of what we're doing, Onar?
Absolutely,
All right,
absolutely.
very good.
But since I assume most people know objectivism quite well who follow us, but I'm not sure everyone knows the dim hypothesis so well. So maybe we should say a few words on that.
Yeah, and it is Peikoff's work, it's not Rand's work.
That's right. So do you want to go ahead with that, or should I? Or
Well, let's see. Let me give it the bare bones, and then you elaborate on it if you like. So
okay,
the D is a disintegrated attitude towards ideas, where you just want to spread ideas apart and not relate them. The M is a misintegrated attitude towards ideas, where you choose some idea like mystical faith or the patriotism or racism, and you integrate around that. And the I is correct integration, where you're objective about it. And then there's D1 and D2, which is just more powerful version of D, and M1 and M2, which is just someone who goes about their life on M1, and M2 is like a demagogue or a preacher or something. So there we go. Why don't you elaborate on that? And I think that'll give us a solid foundation.
I think that's a pretty good summary. I would just like to add that it, Peikoff has perhaps my favorite summary of the whole idea. He says that integration is the core of human conceptualization. That is what human conceptualization is. It's to integrate sense data into something whole, some whole. And he says that there are basically two possible ways of doing errors in integration. One is that you can over integrate and you can under integrate. And he summarizes this by saying that integration corresponds to like one world, and disintegration corresponds to less than one world, and misintegration corresponds to more than one world. I like that summary very much.
Yeah, that's quite good.
So practically, in terms of like on a line of integration, it means that when you misintegrate, you include in your integration things that shouldn't be there, and when you disintegrate, you refuse to include things that should have been there. I think that's a practical approach. And my thesis is that, first of all, this is definitely Peikoff's legitimate work. This is his original work, and he should receive full credit for it, because even though Ayn Rand was sort of walking a little bit down that path, she never conceptualized this as clearly as Peikoff ever did. So he's really, really good at this. And I think that if Ayn Rand had known about the dim hypothesis and used it as a tool at the time that she was formulating her theory, she would have been able to protect her objectivism in a better way than just simply like trademarking it by calling it objectivism. If she would have been able to use the dim tool framework to prevent others from attacking her philosophy. So my thesis is that like Peikoff uses when he formulates the dim hypothesis, he's doing archaeological work in history and in philosophy and in art. So he's trying to just find out, is this really a true representation of reality? Is this the way the mind works, that we typically do these types of errors? Either we over integrate or we under integrate. And he concludes that yes, this is precisely what we do. But I want to apply it the other way around. Rather than saying I'm going to do archaeology, I want to say if Ayn Rand had been alive when this was formulated, she could have used it as a tool, as a template for formulating a firewall. So my basic thesis is the following: is that when she wanted to protect her philosophy, she should have thought that there are basically two ways of attacking any concept in her philosophy, either from M or from D, so from above or from below, so to speak. So in some areas, almost by accident, was able to protect both ways. And the perfect example of this is her view of the government, of the state. Now, she was very clear from the very beginning that she was against statism. Statism is misintegration. It's too much government, right? And she was very clear about that. And then Rothbard came along, fortunately, and reminded her that there are crazy people in the world that believe that in anarcho-capitalism. And this was such a attack on her on her philosophy. Sorry, I have to make a little cough here.
You're fine.
This was such an attack that she had to protect herself. So she said anarcho-capitalism is crap. So now she has a wall against statism up and a wall against anarchism down, D. So now she is protected both ways. Excuse me. So what do you think of the idea so far?
Yes, she didn't know about the dim hypothesis. No. We should say that. She didn't even know the idea of it. She's protected from the anarchist side and the statist side, but how is her philosophy protected in the sense that she said this or that? I mean, it's protected by the structure and nature of her philosophy.
As Objectivism has proven, it is now possible to attack her from below, from D, from disintegration. Most of what she did was to protect from above, from misintegration. So when she said that she was against racism, for instance, she was protecting from above, from misintegrating into this racial thing. But she never met someone like the racial version of Rothbard in her lifetime. So she could never imagine the progressives who basically used the same kind of statistical arguments as the racists, but in reverse.
What's an example of that?
Like we observe that one group or one is doing better than another group, and therefore it must be racism. So that's an attack from below, right? You're not integrating properly that there are statistical patterns. They refuse to accept that there is anything such as a like difference, like let's say racial differences or something like that. They may be on statistical.
Now, interestingly, what they're rebelling against, I think, is the old-fashioned idea that because there is a disparity in whatever, therefore somebody's superior. You know, because Europe is more advanced, therefore white people are superior. And so they're rebelling by that by saying, no, it proves that white people are racist.
That's right.
So now it doesn't actually prove either. It doesn't prove superiority or
no, it doesn't,
or that we're systematically racist.
But the point is that Ayn Rand was only protecting herself from racism. She was condemning racism in the same strong language that she condemned statism. But because she didn't protect herself in the same way from below, like she did with anarcho-capitalism, and sort of put the crazy anti-racist progressives in the same category of D as anarcho-capitalist, it's now easy for objectivists to go around calling everyone a racist. I'm talking about the Objectivists, right?
Right, yeah.
Another example would be to say that she was protecting herself from above when it came to gender differences in genders. She rejected the idea that women had only one role and men had only one role. So you can only judge people by their sex, right? By their gender. This is the same basic idea as racism, which is a form of misintegration of gender. But she never ever thought that someone would come from below and said that there is no such thing as gender. There is no such thing as sex.
Right. So she didn't protect. She never even mentioned.
No, because she didn't have the creativity to imagine such evil. Like she was a good person and she couldn't imagine that anyone would do something like that. I usually say that when you read Ayn Rand, like one of the reasons that many people reject her books as bad literature is that they say that her villains are cardboard villains. They're cartoons. They're not real life. But the fact of the matter is that if you compare the villains in both Fountainhead and in Atlas Shrugged, they are now today more realistic than your average social justice warrior, right?
Like Chewie, for example, or like the Gallant Gallstone author.
Like in Fountainhead, there were like many like tiny villains who were saying things like everything is relative, everything is subjective, things like that, tropes. But so Tui is like is a very realistic bad guy, incredibly realistic. But many of these minor figures, they were just like mouthpieces of like everything is subjective. There is no value that is, nothing is real, and so forth. All of that stuff from Fountainhead. And when people criticized Ayn Rand very often on her writing, they say, these are not realistic figures. No one is that one-dimensional. And the fact of the matter is that those figures that people thought were too one-dimensional, they are in fact multi-dimensional compared to a social justice warrior.
Yeah.
So she just couldn't, she did her best to present like ultimate evil, but she didn't get close. I mean, she couldn't just imagine anyone being like a social justice warrior.
Which, now, I'm tempted to dismiss the social justice warriors as nihilists.
Yeah, but she just couldn't picture that. I mean, she brushed off nihilism, but she didn't, like she brushed off certain philosophers who were nihilists, but she didn't actually consider the possibility that ordinary people, ordinary students, would behave like that.
Now, what is your proposal then to provide a defense that she didn't conceive of even needing?
Yes, if my point is here that we can now not go fix objectivism, because I mean her words are fixed, right? So anything that we add on to it, like the dim, I mean it's her intellectual error that did it. But even so, it's not part of objectivism. But we can sort of make a hypothesis and say that if she was alive and she had known the tools of dim, this is what she would have done. She would have said, I'm going to go through every single thing in my philosophy and I'm going to look for two ways of attacking dim, attacking every concept, either from misintegration or from disintegration. And even though I can't picture the disintegration, I just have to put in a firewall on both sides. And if I do that, I'm pretty safe. And in addition, if she had then also said that, okay, if I didn't put in a firewall, I'm going to put in a general firewall. Like if you over-integrate, then you're doing something wrong. If you under-integrate, then you're doing also something wrong. So it's possible to attack my philosophy from two angles, something like that. And if she had said something like this, I think that much of what she's now suffering from, this split in objectivism, or possible split in objectivism, it wouldn't have happened. So much of the challenge we see now and the infighting comes from the lack of dim as a protective tool.
Now, what do you propose? Do you have a proposal for how to address that?
Well, first we need to spread the word.
Let me just say whatever you're driving at here is going to give us a way to look at the issues we're facing, which show us how the Objectivists, as we call them, are having a disintegrated attitude.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so Objectivism is in general a form of disintegration. So now we have actually, rather than just giving some sort of vague description and vague attempt at making some categorization, we're saying they're D types.
Now let's flesh that out. What do we mean by that?
Okay, let me first say that one of the things that I think that Peikoff discussed but didn't go into in depth is that if you are D type, then you can't really tell the difference between I and M. I and M looks the same.
Yeah.
So therefore, if someone is like anti-racist, then you can't tell the difference between a racist and someone who just acknowledged the existence of race.
Or facts.
Yes. And similarly, someone who is an ethno-nationalist racist cannot tell the difference between D and I. Someone who is open borders and someone who wants to have free immigration into the context of a free society with where you can't vote away rights and so forth. So in other words, D and I look the same to M, and I and M looks the same to D. So therefore, the pendulum tends to swing between D and M because no one knows the stuff in the middle, which is I.
Right.
And I say middle. I know that Peikoff hates the idea of calling it sort of like a compromise between the two. That's not what I mean. Like a compromise between D.
Yeah. Don't take that language literally. Yeah. Sure.
That's right.
He said he wasn't sure how to. Maybe he should name it the mid hypothesis.
Yes,
MID.
He refused that.
But he said that's even worse because then it's naming it literally the medium. Okay, yeah. So, all right. So go ahead.
All right. I do disagree with Peikoff on that point. I think he should have named it mid and referenced not this idea of compromise, but the Aristotelian mean. Because Aristotle is actually a very integrated thinker, and he was thinking in terms of too much and too little. He was perhaps the first proto-inventor of the dim hypothesis. That's Aristotle.
True. It is his mediocrity worship is a crude version of the dim hypothesis, really.
That's right. I'm not trying to defend his idea that mediocrity is good, but he was onto something. He was actually trying to capture the idea of the dim. That's my theory.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we can first get the idea out that we think that there is a disintegration going on in especially the Ayn Rand Institute and the people in that circle, and that those people, because they tend to be a little bit disintegrated, tend to view those who are integrated and disintegrated as the same thing. So it's easy for them to label them as statist, or because they might be in favor of tariffs or something like that. Then you will fall in the disintegration category. Like, it's hard to tell the difference between a nationalist who just wants tariffs and doesn't understand economics, and someone who's integrated and understands that this is a specific surgical tool in an economic war, as opposed to using guns. Like,
Right.
we have to. Tariffs is using guns. It's in fact using it on our own citizens.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very mild form of warfare, and it saves probably a lot of soldier lives because we don't have to actually go into use bullets and so forth. Now, in my view, that's an integrated view of that subject. So just like you can defend the usage of guns in some cases in war, you can possibly defend the usage of tariffs in some very limited cases in war. So it has to be a situation of war where we're identifying an enemy.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you're disintegrated, you will see someone who says that as the same as a statist. So that will the disintegrated guy would say that this is just statism, which is M type. error.
Now, their activity of disintegration really involves dropping the context of whatever it is that they're arguing about. And
but notice how easy it is to do this. So I'm not willing to give them any kind of malice or bad thoughts. I think that this is an honest mistake because it's so easy to drop a context. I mean, if you have a blind spot, you're just doing like a blind person who puts on a red sock and a green sock and doesn't know, right? So I think that the right approach here is to assume that they're doing this not on purpose, that they believe that they are integrated, and therefore misinterpret the true integration, what I claim is true integration, as M-type. That's what I believe. That's my hypothesis now. Yeah. And we can use the dim hypothesis to present this as a way of communicating this, that this is an actual intellectual argument. We're using Peikoff to argue that there's something wrong in the R camp that we roughly call objectivism. What we mean by objectivism is actually slightly disintegrated objectivists. Not in all areas, but in some specific limited areas.
Yeah, and it's limited to the areas that are controversial today, let's say, yes. And they are disintegrated in the fact that they are simply using the principles from objectivism in a vacuum without checking with reality. You should take those principles and check with reality and integrate them into reality, not let them stand alone. Like free trade is a value, therefore free trade. Well, what about the world we live in? You know, and open borders or immigration. Immigration's a value because Ayn Rand's life was saved by it. Therefore, let everybody, unlimited numbers, immigrate? That's insane.
Now, this is rationalism. It's like Peikoff in one of his lectures on induction in philosophy was absolutely hammering that idea. I don't recall his exact example, but it was like typical deductive reasoning, and he was hammering it totally down as a very flawed thinking. And I think that it's very easy to, I'm not blaming anyone for being evil or being bad thinkers. This is just something that's very easy to fall into that pattern. Like if you don't know you're doing a mistake, well, then you're just doing a mistake. And when you first have disintegrated something or misintegrated something, it becomes invisible to you. So I think that this is what has happened in this case. And I think we can make a pretty good case when we're using this conceptual framework that advanced objectivists are able to understand. So if you say that gender is real, you're not a sexist or misogynist or something like that. Like to say that, to disintegrate the idea that sex and gender has no biological basis whatsoever, that's a disintegrated view. And the alternative to that is not to say that the women have to stay in the kitchen, right? That's not the misintegrated alternative, right? So, so I gave an example from like statism versus anarchism, but it's possible to take almost any concept or any theme or variable in Ayn Rand's thinking and then applying dim to it, saying how can you add more that shouldn't be there, and how can you take away things that should be there. So now we've given a couple of examples, but if you take the example of let's apply to open borders, because if I say now, as let's say that Donald Trump says, if people are moving in slow motion over a generation across the border, they don't have guns, but they acquire one very weak type of gun, which is the right to vote. Then over a period of several generations, this is demographic warfare. It's an invasion. Now, You can then say, if you're disintegrationist, you say, where is the invasion? You fail to integrate the idea that there's something going on here. Now, what they can rightfully say is that an invasion requires conscious planning and so forth. So they can then accuse us of thinking in terms of conspiracy. And I think that this is a valid critique, because conspiracy is the prime example of misintegration. Now, if you say that conspiracy theory is misintegration, what is disintegration? It's the idea that there's no patterns to behavior. There's no, like, you cannot never integrate groups into statistical patterns that have real effects.
Now they feel confident on that ground, the Objectivists, because they keep saying there are only individuals. It's all about the individual. So they use D to drop the context of that individual is from a society and a culture and.
And now I'm going to do something. This is wild stuff. It's very crucial. If Ayn Rand had been alive, she would have recognized that she was proposing a false dichotomy between individualism and collectivism, because that's only two. That's misintegration and integration. Where's the D? Where's the D? There's no D. She never gave a name to that, but there is a name in physics, and it can be applied to it here. It's like basically atomism, like atomism. Like you reduce it to an atom, like you disintegrate the whole world down to just atoms.
So even the individual is too integrated. They even take the individual apart.
Yes. So in other words, when you say, because let me give you an example. This is from Dim. Peikoff says that you have. Aristotle says one in the many. That is his summary of Aristotle's integration, that you take many individuals, parts, and you integrate it into one without removing the parts. That's one in the many. And misintegration is then one without the many, and disintegration is the many without the one. But there is one alternative version of integration, which Peikoff never talks about, and which Aristotle didn't talk about, and it is the many in the one, not just the one in the many, but the many in the one. And in fact, if I ever go about starting doing like YouTubing, I'm thinking about calling my YouTube channel something along that line, many in the one, or forest in the tree. Forest in the tree is one of the examples I'm thinking of calling it. So we think about the tree as a unit in the forest, right? But if I now tell you that, okay, a tree, it grows to become incredibly tall, becomes incredibly super tall. Why does it do that? Well, it spends so much energy just growing up into the sky. It could have saved so much energy if it just stayed a little tiny bush, right? So why does it have to grow so tall? Well, it's adapted to its environment. And what is its environment that it is evolutionary adapted to? Other trees. So it has internalized many other trees into itself. So that's many in the one, the forest in the tree. So inside every tree, there's a little forest.
All right. And now draw. What are we going to draw a parallel for human beings?
Yes, we are social animals. We're adapted to living in a society, right? And so even though we are individuals, we are also, just like fish is adapted to living in water, we're adapted to living in society. That doesn't mean that just we are subsumed. Like we don't have to misintegrate. We don't have to say that the group is everything and we're just a part. No, that's not what. Because the tree doesn't care about the forest ultimately. It's just adapted to the forest, right? So we don't have to fall into the trap of saying the tree is just a little cogwheel in this great forest. From the individual tree, that's certainly not true. The tree is adapted specifically to living among other individual trees in the forest so that they live together. So it's a form of social existence. We too are social beings in that sense. We're adapted through our language, through just sexual reproduction. All of this is assumes that there are other human beings around that we're living together with. Now that if you're D type, it's very easy now to say, oh, this sounds a lot like groupthink. Like, it's very hard. It's easy to say that this form of integration is the same as misintegrating into collectivism. But that's not what this is. You should be able to hold two thoughts in at the same time. Just like one in the many the one doesn't kill the many. It doesn't remove the many. Then the many in the one doesn't remove the one. So right. Now this is the basic outline here, and in this sense, it means that when you're viewing an individualism, then you're always looking at the context in which the individual is living. You can never just say there's an individual and it has nothing to do with the individual that is next door. You're always saying the individual has to have an environment to live in. So we're taking into account the proper environment of each individual. So how does this apply to politics? Well, first of all, we need to have a culture of reason. That is a requirement for living. And if we, for instance, allow in lots of other individuals invading the space of a rational culture and diluting that rational culture is going to be replaced by an irrational culture, which then becomes a kleptocracy, and we get socialism and all of these things. So by importing too many socialists at the same time, then you're destroying the fabric of individualism by removing away what keeps this society running as a place that's good to live for the individual.
Yeah, now the best answer I have for that's not going to work for Europe. I know you guys are screwed, but the best answer I have for that is just have a government where it doesn't matter what people vote on. They really can't vote on very much important stuff. So even if you
that is the answer. That is the integrated answer, right?
And even if they vote on a bunch of bad stuff, you still have guns and freedom of speech. So so at the end of the day, it's going to be really hard for them to destroy America. Like I said, Europe, you guys are just screwed. I don't know what you guys are going to do. So I don't know what your answer is. I mean, what was your answer in the 1930s? It was just to go ahead and go drive over the cliff. So
yeah, the 1930s is a very special period, and so we have to be a little bit careful when trying to draw conclusions that are not very unique to that. For instance, one of the things that people don't take into account is how many fathers were killed in World War I. So you got this hippie culture in the 1920s, with lots of fatherless German kids, and looking for order, looking for meaning in their lives, and they were having excessive D-style lifestyle, disintegrated lifestyle, and they had this hunger for integration, and this backfired, and so then this strict father figure came along and said, we're going to fix everything for you, and this just bam, M2 into National Socialism, right? So that's a very specific historical event, and it doesn't have to go like that. But if we can, like, the ominous parallels is quite prophetic, because I mean the D culture is there in America, and the conversation you had with Luke was very interesting. When I wasn't aware of how they were these board libertarians who were very D-type, and at some point they just almost flipped over and became M-types, because they saw that their own D disintegrated anarchism was bankrupt. And they didn't know that there was an integrated alternative, so they went straight for M. This is like typical pendulum thesis, antithesis problem during history, is that people swing too far one way or the other. And this could very well happen in America too, and definitely in Europe. As I sometimes say, Germans are really, really nice until they're not.
Yeah.
So we know that this has happened before. But in the long run, this idea you said of making sure that people can't vote away your rights, that is a good solution. I think that Singapore has done many things right. They're basically saying, if you're an immigrant there, fine, you're welcome, but you can't vote away people's rights. So you don't have demographic warfare in Singapore. And it's an incredibly open system, open society. I mean, 40% are immigrants, are non-citizens there. And no one's complaining about it. So,
and look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong, well, I mean, it's being corrupted by the Chinese Communist Party now, but it didn't even have elected officials. I mean, so
no.
you couldn't infiltrate and vote bad laws in because you couldn't vote laws in.
Yeah. And notice how now that many people haven't figured this out about Hong Kong, that what's going on in Hong Kong is not about this specific law. That was just the drop that created this problem right now. What they have been complaining about and worried about for a long time is that China, mainland China, is doing demographic warfare on Hong Kong, the population that's already there. So people can now come in, free immigration from mainland China into Hong Kong, and the Hong Kongers can't stop it. And so they're being demographically replaced, not by another race, I mean, they're all Chinese, but by people who are culturally communists in their head. And they are given the same kind of rights as the people who have lived there for like a century or more. Like, they just come in there and bam, they have all the same rights as everyone else in terms of like voting rights and like representation. So they have some kind of democracy in Hong Kong where you have representation in the government based on the population and so forth. It's not really a democracy, but it definitely means that mainland China is getting a lot of influence there. So what we're seeing in Hong Kong is actually a demographic destruction of a capitalist society by a communistic regime. And this is precisely the argument that now it's time to start looking and integrating these facts and seeing them as a form of warfare, as a form of demographic warfare. And it doesn't have to be a conspiracy. I hate this conspiracy thing. I like, every time I hear conspiracy theories, I just slam them hard because they destroy everything for the rest of us. Because you can never integrate. You can never generalize and draw conclusions about patterns of behavior without having people call you a conspiracy theorist. So, for instance, my reply to that, the integrated reply, would be like, look at the locusts in the Bible, the grasshoppers, the swarms of grasshoppers coming into Egypt, and that was more or less referred to as a plague. We could use the term invasion. It's wrong to use the term invasion, but it's very close. It's invasion without the consciousness, without the planning. It's not a conspiracy by these grasshoppers. They have a very limited mind, but they're just each an individual following their own needs. It's just so that if you have many people who have the same idea in their mind, they're acting as if it is a conspiracy without it being a conspiracy. So if you have a bunch of socialists from kleptocratic countries coming into the United States, it has the same effect as if it is a conspiracy.
Yeah,
but it
doesn't matter.
Being a conspiracy.
It doesn't matter whether it's a conspiracy or not. It ends up with the same results.
Yes, and we should be allowed to integrate that effect. We shouldn't be forced to say, no, you have to think of this as each individual as an atom that don't cluster together with others. Because when you have a group that comes across, like look at what happens in California right now. People are waving the Mexican flag all over the place. They refuse to speak English, and so this is a clustering effect. This is like they are self-integrating to their group. They're forming a group, and this is what I'm talking about. You can't view each individual just as an individual. If you have only one Spanish-speaking person in California, then he quickly has to learn English in order to survive. But if you have everyone in your street and everyone around you is waving the Mexican flag and playing Mexican music on Mexican television stations, and everyone speaks Spanish or Mexican, and you don't have to integrate, or rather, you keep the integration you already have, the national integration of Mexican. So you have an enclave of Mexican integration in rather than integrating into the U.S. society, they keep their Mexican integration. That's an invasion,
Right.
but not a conscious invasion. An invasion like a plague, like the locusts.
Right.
I don't want anyone to think that I'm making any comparisons between Mexicans and grasshoppers here.
Too late.
No. This is just an analogy to show that you can have a swarm effect. That a swarm can come and without having any conspiracy between any individual entities, but still acting as if it is a form of structural conspiracy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just using that as an example now that the D-types, those who are not individualists but are atomists that refuse to think of the individual as naturally integrating together with other individuals, that person is going to look and see, oh, there's a Spanish guy and there's a Spanish guy. Okay, those are just separate individuals. They have nothing to do with each other. But when you have enough of these separate individuals who all speak Spanish, and who all are socialists, and who all love Mexico, live together in one place, you get integration in that place that you don't want. Because then they don't become American. They just keep on being Mexican, and they vote Mexican.
Now, are you quite worried about California, or is this an analogy for France and London?
I'm very worried about California. The elites have for a long time just considered California, elites in Mexico, I mean, they have regarded California as Mexican territory that just isn't quite Mexican yet. They lost it illegitimately to America in the previous wars, but they want it back, and they want it by the slow move. So it's not a conspiracy to say that the government published material for how to sneak into America. This is a government published material for this is how you illegally immigrate into America. These are the rights you have. You can get these and these kind of social security things. This is how you avoid detection. This is how you got across the border. This was public information by the Mexican government. If that's not as close as you can get to an actual real invasion, then I don't know what. I mean, it's very, very close to be an actual demographic warfare, a conscious warfare, like what China is doing right now in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And in all of this.
Certainly rises to the level of a conspiracy, for
yes.
sure.
But I'm very wary of calling it a conspiracy because, I mean, everyone thinks then moon landing is fake and all of this crap. So that's not what I'm talking about. This is just like ordinary conspiracy, just like China is literally taking over the South China Sea by building islands. That's not just something that spontaneously happens. That's part of a plan that they have of taking over the South China Sea and the whole region. Yeah. And by the same token, Mexicans are thinking very nationalistically, and the Mexican elite, they want California back, and they're well on their way of getting it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen to California. I think it might be another Detroit, but you raised the possibility that it will declare independence and become Mexican, or Mexico will seize it, or
Yep.
something like that. And if not 10 years from now, then 50 years from now.
Might be closer to 30 actually. Like it doesn't have to be 50. It can happen within our generation. Like
Now,
before we take that last trip to the grave.
do you propose that that's a justification for closing the border then,
Well,
or building the wall?
first of all, it is building a wall is important, but we have to also start talking about getting rid of all these all of these things that make it easy for illegal immigrants to actually take over the country. So, and it has to be, we have to start talking about that. If you are against voter ID, that is actually treason. There is only enemies of America. Only the enemies of a country would propose not having voter ID. There's no country on earth that doesn't have voter ID.
Yeah, it's
South
very
Africa.
strange. It's definitely the Democrats that don't want voter ID.
Yes.
But there are Americans who are afraid that if we go down that route, it's just going to be one more way for the government to control us.
Well, no, this is very different. Voter ID is not a way of controlling us. It's just a way of controlling who gets to vote, right? You have to be a registered voter. And for now, American citizens actually are less in danger of losing that right compared to illegal immigrants have more to gain from not having voting IDs than the other way around.
Yeah.
And like voting IDs is used all over the world. Like in South Africa, they have it. So it's not like South Africans mostly cannot read and write. They're not educated at all. Like blacks in America are super duper advanced in education and skills compared to most South Africans. And the South Africans have voter ID. But in America, you hear that, oh, no, we can't allow voter IDs because the blacks are too stupid.
Yeah. That's all a ruse.
The hell?
They say they don't have access to internet and so on. But, yeah, that's just because the left, I don't know how many elections they would win if they couldn't have these dead people voting and all this stuff.
Yes. So my point is all of these things, all of this trying to hack in the election, the dead people voting, making it easier for illegal immigrants to vote, making it easier for and now what is it, Beto O'Rourke that went to Mexico to raise money for his election campaign?
That's crazy.
Now, that's treason.
Yeah, that should be illegal. That's got to be illegal.
Well, I mean, the whole thing about Russia trying to like a foreign nation trying to influence the election.
Yeah.
And he goes there and says, Mexico, I want you to influence the election.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. It's amazing, and he won't be prosecuted, of course, because the deep state is democratic. So.
Yes. Now, so my point is that America is in pretty good shape in terms of sense of life and all of these things, but the demographic shifts, don't underestimate that. I mean, yes, there's lots of guns, but the way things are going to happen is that, like, all of a sudden, one day people are going to wake up to California declaring Spanish as their main language and saying that, well, we pledge allegiance to Mexico.
Yeah, I don't know what. I'll tell you what. I'm more worried about the coming events in Europe.
Oh yes, no. I'm talking like objectivism has a stronghold in America. So I'm talking about it from an American context. I'm very worried about what goes on in Europe, but in Europe there are very few objectivists too, and you don't have this culture that's ready for objectivists to sort of colonize.
Well, what I'm hoping is that events in Europe will provide us a way to think about the world, including immigration, and that we will straighten out, we'll put our house into order as events in Europe unfold. We'll put our border, southern border will be put into order, and California might even be put into order in the next 10 or 20 years. That's my hope, that events in Europe will force our hand to really deal with these issues.
If I'm going to try to criticize myself, I would say that you made a good point earlier in another conversation, that look at how bad things were in the Red Decade in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And we came out of that pretty well. And, well, we came out of the stagflation period in the 1970s with the hippies and all of that. And we got Reagan. So, and if you look at the way that Reagan won, he won pretty much every state. And this was like basically everyone saying, okay, we're fed up with that crap. But now we might be heading for another round, a new battle. The problem is that people don't understand, like, if you integrate properly, you understand how sticky culture is. It's about, like, parents teaching their children. Obviously, the children are more likely to have their parents' values than a random person, right? And what it turns out, like, studies show that culture is sticky for up to 7 generations or more. Even in Pennsylvania, where you had two rival Christian tribes, you can still see the cultural difference between them now, more than 200 years later. And those were both whites, European whites.
Yeah, let me say that French descendants in America make 70% the wage that British immigrants to America, descendants of British immigrants, make.
Yep. And Scandinavian descendants in America are above average.
Yeah, they owned the Midwest for a while. They were
yes.
the boss of the Midwest.
And if you look at the culture of trust in the Scandinavian states, like Dakota, the Dakotas and Minnesota and all of those places, they have a culture of trust that mirrors the Scandinavian culture of trust in Scandinavia. So even now, 100 years plus later, after the major immigration, they still have strong Scandinavian traits. And by traits, I mean cultural traits. And so you have to expect that if someone comes from a culture, that culture that they're bringing is not going to disappear at the border. They're bringing it with them. And it's going to stay there for 7 generations. So if you're bringing in socialists from hellhole countries, and they don't understand that the way they voted in their own countries is why they have problems in their native countries. So they keep on voting the way. Now, I know that people make this say, oh, but they're fleeing these socialist regimes. They must have learned. They must have learned. Well, again, without any too much comparison here, but the locusts, the grasshoppers, they also flee the kind of ecological disaster that they create. They eat up an entire field, and when it's all eaten, they're starving and they're fleeing. They are the ones creating the disaster, but it's just part of their cycle to go to another place and eat that thing up. I'm not, again, comparing immigrants to grasshoppers who are eating up the country. That's not what I mean. But the idea that you can just say that just because someone is fleeing from something, that they are the good guys, that is a wrong conclusion.
Yeah, that would seem to me, it seems like then you could manufacture objectivists just by having a socialist country and people are fleeing the socialist country, therefore they are objectivists because they understand now that socialism is bad and so on.
That's right, which is absolutely false.
Yeah, that's certainly not the case. So we're importing possibly people who are going to do the same thing to our country because they have no idea what they even did to their country. They just think their country went wrong somehow. Maybe they
Yes.
think their country went wrong because selfish bad guys corrupted the system, and they're going to come here and build real socialism without the selfish bad guys.
Yes. So but they're voting kleptocratic. Like when they come, they say, if we don't steal from other people are going to steal from us. So they vote kleptocratic, which means left wing, right?
Yeah.
And the left is in cahoots with them. In one sense, I think they do understand that these people, that the Democrats are criminals, because they're actively targeting minority groups to plunder the majority, right? That's not how decent people behave. But they see how the game is played, and they say, we better do our looting now and before we are getting the short end of the stick. It's a very normal way for someone who is raised in a corrupt culture to think like that. But we have to take that into account. So, like the Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag archipelago, he said something very profound. It's that everyone thinks that the corruption and tyranny comes from the top. Not true. It comes from the bottom to top. The corruption spreads throughout the whole society, from bottom to top. So corruption, once it takes hold, it takes hold just as much with the little guy as the top guy. Everyone is trying to eat everyone. And so when poor people from these corrupt, very corrupt countries come to the West, they're bringing that cultural corruption with them, and like there's only a limited amount of people we can take like that, and especially when they're coming into a welfare state. When they're coming into a welfare state, that's like prime real estate for corruption. Like it's like an invitation for corrupt people.
Yeah.
So we're not placing the ground for people who are just honest and decent, like in the 19th century America, where you didn't get a welfare check once you arrived.
Yeah. So, okay, go ahead.
Okay. No, I was finished.
I was gonna say the people in the 1800s, a lot of them went back. A lot of them came to America
Right.
and went back.
Therefore, you got the self-selection that only those who were most entrepreneurial and self-reliant actually survived the immigration process, becoming actual citizens. And I think that filter, that reality filter, that you filter out the bad people by a reality filter, that's the best way to do it. Problem is, at the moment, there's such a push right now for bringing in socialist voters. Like the Democrats are truly the enemy of America, like actually treasonous in their behavior from top to bottom, because their entire framework is that we don't want to build a wall because that might stop illegal immigrants. We go to Mexico to raise money from Mexicans because we want to take Mexicans to take over America, and we're not having voter ID because that prevents illegal immigrants from voting. In California, they have a law now that says that you can actually go to a place, go knocking on doors, and say, here's like a voting blanket. Do you want me to vote for you? That kind of thing.
Wow, that's insane. That's just manufacturing votes.
Yes, that's manufacturing vote. So that's what I'm saying. This is treason. We are being invaded, but not from outside. America would have been safe if not for the treasonous left, who's actually invading America from the inside. It's a coup from the inside. And again, it's not a conspiracy type coup. This is just the way. It's a coup in the way of the cuckoo, the cuckoo's nest, right? The cuckoo is not thinking in conspiratorial thoughts that now I'm going to take over a nest. It just does what it does, and things happen. So there doesn't have to be a master plan behind this. Just a lot of individual corrupt actions.
Yeah, it can lead to disaster at the end.
And if we don't integrate those individual corrupt actions into a greater whole, then we are disintegrating, and we're ending up with asking the American people to apologize to immigrants, to illegal immigrants, right?
Yeah, that's the D type, yeah.
That's D2.
Yeah, D2, yeah, that's really bad D type. So
Yes.
our integrated approach should be to value the immigrants who are valuable to our society.
Yes.
But not to value the ones that are damaging to our society.
You always have to start with the question: is immigration in my self-interest? And if you're saying that I have to abide by this lofty principle that's going to destroy every value I care about, it's going to destroy my country, and it's going to take over and take away my individual rights and turn it into a socialist hellhole, but I have to abide by these principles by some mysterious altruistic reason. That's crazy. It's like sneaking in altruism the back door through disintegration.
Yeah. Now I have to mention here the podcast I did with Sunny on the Sunny podcast show the other day, and we talked not only about this but about the way that the social media companies are behaving. It's almost as though they are taking orders from the Chinese Communist Party of who to deplatform and stuff. So
PayPal has actually said that.
Yeah, exactly. Peter Thiel said that. Yep. So there might be more actual, real conspiracy to it than we're even willing to entertain the thought of.
Well, I wrote an article a couple of months back about Robert Spencer, not the Richard Spencer that we talked about. Robert Spencer is an Islam critic, and Patreon said you can't be a Patreon, get on Patreon anymore because MasterCard told us to take you away.
What does MasterCard have to do with it?
Well, MasterCard has presence in the Middle East, right? So that's an example of it's quite possible that MasterCard has received pressure from Islamic countries in the Middle East and say that if you want to be a big boy here in our countries, you have to do some house cleaning on behalf of Islam in America, right?
Yeah,
so amazing. Now that sounds conspiratorial, but we know for a fact that, like Saudi Arabia, their idea of offering aid to the migrants is to say that they're going to build mosques in Europe.
Yeah, and that's what they do. They build mosques and schools over there.
Yes. So like if they are, but they don't allow churches to be built in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So, and that's an example of something where now we should, just like with the tariffs, this is now approaching a cultural warfare. If a foreign nation can build and finance actual institutions of cultural war in another nation, but you can't do the opposite in their country, that's war.
Yeah, like German National Socialist societies all throughout America in the 1930s, or something like that, which didn't really exist, but to the extent that it did exist during World War II, that was not allowed. You were not allowed to march for the Nazis during World War II.
Precisely. And so notice again here, I'm stressing, it's so easy to lump together the I with the M when you are D-type, because from a D-type, everything looks like M. And therefore, I'm making a case that, yes, they do look the same from the perspective of T, but if you're actually I, you understand very well the difference between I and M. There is a difference between here.
Yeah.
And so it's not like so Peikoff was actually onto something when he said that we should be very careful allowing building mosques near the World Trade Center.
They wanted to build one right after the event. They wanted one right downtown there, and we stopped it.
And he was on to the idea that we should identify Islam as a form, and we should integrate it in as a form of enemy of the West, who's actually not just an abstract enemy, like it's not the book that is the enemy, but it's real people and real nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia who are waging cultural war against and are colonizing and imperializing the West. And some of these are just soft imperialism, like building mosques and stuff like that, and soft economic power. But at the same time, it's a very real danger, and you shouldn't ignore this danger. And like the principle of reciprocity is quite well. If Saudi Arabia is allowed to build mosques in America, then Americans should be allowed to build churches in Saudi Arabia, or objectivist centers. It doesn't have to be churches, but yeah. So you see what I mean. But the fact that you don't have this reciprocity and that you have proxy war by Saudi princes that are not officially part of the government, but they just have loads of money because they are heirs of the government, that's also something that if you're disintegrated, you say, well, this is just an individual. And then you say, no, he's a Saudi prince. And yes, he's not a part of the government, but he's a direct blood relation to people in power. And he has billions of dollars, and he's playing with them.
And not only that, but illegitimately gained. I mean, that's American industry that they're making the money off of. And the profits shouldn't have been going to a bunch of bloodthirsty tribal warfareists who used to be in tents in the desert. We shouldn't have given them billions of dollars.
Now, I think that it's important to be clear here that when we're talking about soft war, fuzzy war, we can't use the full conceptual framework of war. We can't say that this is the enemy, like Nazi Germany or something like that. You have to, if they are only doing soft warfare, and it's not really fully integrated, it's not Saudi Arabia who's actively, as a nation, working against America, then you have to reply roughly with soft warfare and soft language, soft conceptualization. So an example of soft warfare is tariffs, right? So once you understand that tariff is a tool of war, it's a weapon of war, but it's very soft. And I think it was you who said that we're allowed to nuke Iran, but we're not allowed to prevent Iranis from coming into America.
Supposedly, yeah, that's the idea. We can nuke and destroy these countries because they have a bad culture and so on, and they're a threat to us. But we have to have open borders.
From the very same people who you regard as a threat, and that they can bomb to hell.
Yeah.
And now I think that this is this is a big problem, and this is clearly a big hole in just ordinary. Once you just say it like this, everyone who is sort of semi-rational can hear that. Whoa, this doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
There's something wrong about this, and it's because there's some false integration going on here.
Yeah.
And
the first statement is from Peikoff that we should destroy Iran, and the second statement is from Binswanger, and that we should let people come in and apologize to them. So
first we bomb them, nuke them, and then we apologize to them for not having let them in sooner.
Yeah, very strange, very strange. Yeah, those two ideas do not jive. Either Peikoff is right or Binswanger is right, and I'm definitely with Peikoff.
Or I would say that Peikoff is not right, but he's on the right track.
Yeah.
That he's over integrating. He's saying, no, Iran is not a real national enemy like, for instance, Nazi Germany was, or something like that, or the Soviet Union. we have to treat it as a soft enemy. So nuking is a little bit drastic. So we don't want to go down that road unless it's necessary, because there's a lot of downside to this nuking business.
There's a lot of upsides to it too. Japan looks pretty good nowadays.
It does. I absolutely. I'm not trying to talk down nuking. It has a place, but you should still be careful about it. And in World War II, it took a long time before they brought out the nukes.
Yeah.
They did a lot of other things before they did the nukes.
Yeah, they brought out the nukes as damn soon as they could, though.
It is true, but that was actually like a Pearl Harbor attack, and they were actually at war, like in a real old-fashioned war. And we're approaching a time where we have to also reconsider the old-fashioned warfare, because it's very rare that people meet on a theater of war and then just crash into each other and fight and shoot each other. That's not really how things occur at the moment. But as you pointed out that Yaron Brook was okay with doing like electronic warfare, but not tariffs.
Oh, it was James Valiant with Amy Peikoff. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
He said tariffs are no good. Why don't we just do internet warfare against them, or what's it called, cyber warfare?
Cyber warfare, yeah. Now, so I'm not against cyber warfare, but you have to understand that cyber warfare is actually an act of war.
Yeah.
Right.
Versus a 5% or 10% tax on goods to try to push them around. Yeah. I think cyber warfare is insane. It's an insane idea that we would do what? Attack their power plants or something, which they try to do to us all the time. You know, we should do that instead of putting on tariffs. It's just bizarre.
Like, you should at least try the tariffs and see if it works before you go before you escalate.
Yeah, with Mexico, we didn't even have to put the tariffs on. We just threatened to put them on, and they went and put 30,000 troops on their southern border.
Yep. So basically, we got the Mexicans to build the wall.
Yep.
So now the idea. I'm not against cyber warfare, but if you say that tariffs, putting that on your own national people, that's why you shouldn't do it, because you are a nation and you can do whatever you want with China, but not with people who are your own citizens. Then you're saying, okay, so now we're back to this border thing and nation thing, that there's something that's called a nation, and there are limited things that you can do. And one of the things that you're limited in doing is, like, you can't let those other nations that you can do cyber warfare against necessarily just come over here.
Right.
The Kyle Bass had this interesting interview with Stephen Bannon about that you shared also on Facebook, where Stephen Bannon talks about how the Chinese CIA is financing students coming into American universities and working on top secret military technology. And they're financed by the Chinese CIA.
And we're letting it happen.
Like, you don't need to have cyber warfare. You can start by not allowing them to do cyber warfare against us. That would be a start, right?
Yeah.
So clear, like, obviously, this is a stupid thing to do. And they have to be laughing every day. Why are we allowing this? Why it's so preventive. But it requires integration. We have to integrate and identify the enemy. And, like, I'm not saying that China is always going to be an enemy, and I'm not saying that Chinese people are bad people or that every Chinese person is an enemy, but identifying that there's something structured and systematic and organized going on right now with the way China is trying to colonize the world, and in a very dubious communist manner. That is something that we should take into account into the way we integrate and formulate policies.
Yeah.
And once you do that, Trump doesn't look so bad what he's doing right now.
Yeah.
In fact, he looks like a four-sided guy.
Looks like, yeah, it looks like some of the stuff that he's doing, you have to look into it and say, oh, wow, he's right to be doing that.
Yes, because when I heard the tariffs thing, I was like, what the hell is that? But the more I look into it, that this is like what he has understood, and he's been blabbering on about this for 20 years. That China is the enemy. Now, and of course, I would just say this is conspiracy theories, but then it's like, no, 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 no. It doesn't mean it like they are trying to take over America. And it's just saying that they're trying to carve out a larger chunk of the world that is under Chinese control, under communist control.
At our expense.
Yes. Not just at our expense, but at pretty much everyone's expense.
Yeah.
And like these what was it, ACDV China? I would
ADV China. Yep.
ADV, so that's the I've been following them for years, and it's been really fun to watch them. But now in the recent years, they have become dark in their outlook on China. They've started with becoming very political about China.
Part of the reason for that is they moved to America.
Yes.
They're located here, so the subjects they used to couldn't talk about, now they can talk about.
I learned, actually, it was when I watched those motorcycle guys. First of all, I learned a lot about China, a lot. I mean, it feels like living in China, because they are speaking as someone who has lived in China. They're showing Chinese culture, which was just brilliant. And you see the good parts of China, and you see the very bad parts of China. But this thing about the great cultural change, going back to Mao now, that was scary. Deng Xiaoping had influence until about 1909, maybe until when the Chinese took over Hong Kong, I think. I think that was the start of their grandiose plans. Because until then, Deng Xiaoping was in charge. Like he was this soft guy who after Mao died, turned 180 degrees around and opened up society completely. But of course, he never said that this was his long-term plan of making an open society. He was saying we need to take a little right turn towards capitalism so that we can create our communist utopia. And now we're seeing that left turn again, and it's going really dark. And people just don't think about it. Like Yaron Brook to say, oh, China is not communist because they published my book. Like, he's been there to China, and he's seen all the skyscrapers, and I've seen them too. Like, so like it's very impressive. But then what's going on right now at the top is extremely scary, because they are thinking, like, what people don't understand about the Chinese, that they are an empire that's 4,000 years old. They have survived not just as a nation, but as an empire for 4,000 years. They use the same language and symbols as they used 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So people today can read books that were written 3,000 years ago. That's crazy. And so they have this sense of continuity that we don't. So when they made this deal with Britain, when Britain said, oh, we're going to have Hong Kong for 100 years, Britain said, that's an eternity. China said, that's just a blink of an eye. It's just 100 years. We've lived for 4,000 years. What's 100 years in the grand scheme of things? That's how the Chinese think. And they say, okay, so the capitalists won for now. So let them have their 50 years of domination. But we're thinking 100 years into the future. We're building our great society for the long term. And so we have plenty of time. We're going to, like our Mandarin rulers, we're going to pass it on to our children, and they're going to be the rulers soon in our Mandarin bureaucratic system, the deep state of China, and which is not so deep. It's all in the open, right? And they think long term, like 100 years. So what they're doing now with like, I thought that all this talk about devaluing, like pushing down the money, what's it called, manipulation of the currency. I thought that that was all bullshit. Oh, they don't understand economics, but they do understand economics, but they just don't care, because they say we have 1 billion people who we can put in graves. Like, think about all the people who are used as a filling material in the Great Wall of China. Like, what was it, 100 million people who died there building that wall? They don't care if they can use 100 million Chinese as slaves and keep their currency low. They will do it, because what they will say, let them now believe that they are getting cheap stuff. What we're doing is exactly what the Dutch did and the British did when Spain and Portugal found gold in gold and silver in the Americas. So Spain started buying stuff with gold from Britain and Holland, and they didn't have anything of Britain and Holland. All the gold was with the Spanish. 100 years later, the Spanish no longer had the gold. The British and the Dutch and Germany had the gold, and they had the industry.
Right.
So they got the Spain to finance the construction of the industry in their countries, and after a while, they also got the gold back. So they got both. Mm-hmm. First, they got the Spanish to pay for the industry, and then they got them just to pay. So they paid them twice. So the Spanish had nothing. That's why we call it like the Spanish disease, the economic Spanish disease. Not the Spanish flu, but the Spanish disease. So they were like culturally destroyed for hundreds of years, and they're still trying to recover from that economic disastrous policy. The reason Spain is so underdeveloped today is one of the reasons is because they allowed all the wealth they had, they spent it building up industry in Britain and Holland and Germany and France. And these other countries were very happy, and they're still living off of that industry base. The same thing is China is doing right now. The difference is that China has read history about Spain. They know how this works. So now they have the advantage of seeing in hindsight that, hey, what those British people did by accident, they didn't have any plan behind. We can do that. We have hundreds of millions of Chinese that we can use as slaves to get the Americans and the Europeans to transfer all their industry over to us. And when they've transferred all the industry in the world, then we don't need them anymore. Then we have it.
Then they're in control of the picture. They're in control of the situation at that point.
Yes. Now, I think they do underestimate us, because the Brits and the French and the Dutch, they were pretty good. They were solid people, and they were workhorses, and they were creative, and we had the Enlightenment. So you had all of this thing going on that really pushed things, financed by the Spanish gold. And China has communism. So like East minus West equals 0, right? They don't have what we had. They lack our. So they're going to fail, but they might not fail as badly as we hope, and they might not fail as fast as we hope, and it might get really icky and yucky and bad before it gets better.
Well, Imperial Japan failed, Nazi Germany failed, Soviet Russia failed.
Although they did manage to take over all of Washington.
Yeah, exactly. And
so that's a success, partial success. They took over the IPCC and the UN.
Yeah, and the fact that they've ultimately failed, though, was expensive, and it took a lot of effort on our part.
Yes, extremely expensive. And we could have won much earlier if they didn't have all these communist allies in Washington and in universities and in the UN and all of these places. So, for instance, most objectivists know this, but like it was actually a communist spy who advised America to allow Mao to take over China and not focus on this other guy, this nationalist. He was bad. Whereas Mao, he was a democratic. He loved the people. He was for freedom. So America just allowed Mao to take over the country and didn't support the guy who's created Taiwan. I forget his name. But Taiwan became the enclave of the nationalists who fought Mao. If America had supported that guy, then there would have been no Mao.
Right.
Of course, the outcome might have been the same because the Chinese have this imperialistic culture, and they just keep on reinventing it, even though Mao did his best to destroy Chinese culture with the Cultural Revolution. It just popped up because culture is sticky. It stays around for a long, long time.
Now they did succeed in impoverishing the culture. ADV China talks about this. If you go to Taiwan, you can see these old churches and temples and stuff, and that's all just been destroyed and neglected in mainland China. So that one thing I think about the left that is so scary is the destruction of culture, and where the Russians used to have a certain amount of intelligence and education and playing chess and reading great poetry and writing great books, and they had an intellectual scene. Communism really did a lot to destroy that.
Yeah, it's still around there, and thank goodness for that. But in China, what's left there?
Yeah.
There's nothing left.
Well, what's still left in Russia? I mean, they used to be. If you look in the 1800s,
they have the literature, they have the music, they have the art.
Still, you say?
Yes. So that people are very oriented towards reading these things.
The classics, though. The classics. Yes. Yeah.
And in 1991, after Russia collapsed, 20% of Russians identified as Christian. Now, today, 80% identify as Christian.
Is that right?
Yeah. Now, so notice that is exactly the same thing that happened in China. That after Mao tried to wipe out Chinese culture, it just bubbled back. So communism tried to get rid of the emperor, but no, it was reinvented. The Mandarin bureaucrat regime, that's the Communist Party now, and we have a new emperor in Xi.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So they reinvented the Mandarin system and the emperor system. And I'm pretty sure that if this Taiwan dude had won over Mao, then he would have been the emperor instead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they didn't have the culture for anything other than that.
It might have been less bloody without the
yes.
Communist ideology, but it would have been
right.
ultimately sort of the same. Ultimately, a mess.
But let me chime in. There was something I didn't understand until very recently, and it was when I heard this talk with Steve Bannon and Kyle Bass, it really clicked in place. It's that when I have talked to my friends in Taiwan, in Philippines, and other places, and I talk about Hong Kong, and they said, but we have I'm not planning to go back to Hong Kong there. And then they tell, because there's all these violent rioters and terrorists there. And I'm like, okay, no. Oh yeah, I read it in the newspaper. They're violent and they're rioting and they're trying. The government is trying to control them, but they're so bad. And I'm like, okay, that didn't make any sense. Like, why would they write that? But then I found out that China has done much more to infiltrate Taiwan than it has done to infiltrate America. So they bought all the newspapers, they've bought all the people there in high places. So China, even though Taiwan officially is owned by Taiwan, they're placing their agents all over Taiwan to take over. So now even the Taiwanese people hear in the news in free Taiwan that Hong Kong is being taken over by these evil rioters.
Wow. So Taiwan doesn't even have its own press anymore. The Chinese own the Taiwanese.
Oh, you do have both, but it's not as good as it could have been. It's really bad. And the same thing in the Philippines. The Chinese dominate the news that the Filipinos hear, and they were just right next door. So they're trying to control everything in their region in the South China Sea.
Now, we had this before. We had the communists putting out news all over Europe, and we had to counter it with Voice of America news outlets and stuff like this.
Yes.
We had to. They were telling their side of the story, and we were trying to tell our side of the story. It was always propaganda. I mean, this is communism we're fighting. We're going to have to go back to our same old tactics of trying to disseminate the true story.
Yes. And the point is, as long as we just pretend that there's no problem, that as long as we disintegrate facts and refuse to integrate them, then we're just allowing bad things to happen on our watch. And so I guess that's my point, that's the fight we're having. We're having to fight to make a case for integration of facts. And I'm specifically now talking in the objectivist camp, but also in the culture at large. That yes, there's such a thing as misintegration. You can integrate too much, things that shouldn't be integrated together. But hello, there are lots of facts that need to be integrated into a cohesive whole here.
Yeah.
And this cohesive whole spells that we need to take action. We cannot just pretend that we can act like lots of unconnected atoms. Yeah. And this brings me back then to that Ayn Rand's perhaps greatest failure as a philosopher, if she did, is to fail to say that there were three types of systems: collectivism, individualism, and atomism.
Yeah. And we shouldn't be atomistic in the sense of viewing the individual in the United States of America as being an individualist, and he can just have his own individual relations with China or with Germany or anybody he wants. He's not an individualist. He's an individualist inside the United States. He's not like an individualist in outer space or something.
That's right. So you have to always look at the context. Individualism is contextual. Ayn Rand even says so. And she says there's some bad individualism and some irrational selfishness, and she doesn't understand this. She doesn't put it into words because she lacked dim. But we now have the framework to put into place that thing that Ayn Rand, I'm sure, would have said, oh, duh, of course there should be three categories. There should be the misintegrated one, the collectivists. The whole is greater than the individual. The group is greater than the individual. And then there's the individualism. And then there is atomism, where the whole, the individual is, now how will that be? The whole is greater than the individual. The whole is less than the individual, something like that. Or the individual is less than the...
You have to take... The individual is too much of an integration. They have to take the individual apart on the D side.
And the way they take them apart is not by chopping them into like physical pieces, but to not say that the context of a tree is that inside of a tree is an entire forest that he's adapted to. And we as humans have this part, the whole society holographically inside of us. We have a copy of our context inside us. And part of individualism is to always keep the context, never drop the context. And atomism drops the context. That's individualism with plus context dropping.
Very good. Yeah, I think that this is very good, a very good way of looking at it. I mean, I think Ayn Rand would say that these D2 types are nihilists, and they just want to wipe out values. But having an integrated way of looking at it from the dim hypothesis is better than just having it as a thought somewhere in your ideas. So
and she wasn't disintegrated, but she hadn't done the work of integrating all of these ways of thinking. So whenever she erected a firewall, it was very sporadic and almost random based on what she read in the news or what kind of crazy people she ran into. So she was lucky enough to run into Rothbard. And then she learned that anarcho-capitalism was some crazy stuff that she needed to reject. And if she hadn't just happened to run into that guy, she would have only said statism is bad, right? And she just assumed that no one is so crazy as to say that you can't have anarcho-capitalist society. And if she hadn't put up that wall against anarcho-capitalism, maybe Ari or Ayn Rand Institute would have said that the right thing would be to get rid of the state altogether, right?
Yeah, and
so,
and that would be D type. They certainly wouldn't say to get rid of the state altogether. Okay, all right.
I love of private police and all of the stuff, right?
Right. Yeah, the privatization, which the anarchists, to someone who's just getting into objectivism, the anarchists sound very principled. Yes. Private property and private right. Privatize this, privatize that, privatize the other.
Yes, which is a deductive way of reasoning. It's not inductive, because you can't privatize violence. Violence is the basis. Peace is the foundation upon which you have private property. First, you have to have peace, and then you have private property. Right. So you can't reverse the orders of that. Yeah. So okay. So that is open borders is, in my view, this what the D2 type we're talking about with Binswanger. That is a very limited form of anarcho-capitalism, in my view.
Okay, so we need to get the objectivists back to thinking about the context of the words they're using.
Yes,
like the
because
context.
They're disintegrated.
Yeah, what is an individual? What is a nation? What is a border?
Yes.
These things are not philosophical terms. These things are terms from reality that we take into philosophy.
Yes.
But they're from reality.
Originally, nation meant birthplace, right? Or the place of our ancestors that comes from native or like natal, right? So it comes from Latin, and the idea is that their definition is one people. They use the term one race, that it's a nation of one race, but you don't have to have that genetic component. But they did say one language, one culture that unified people. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have immigrants from other races and other cultures and other values, but you need to have a core of that keeps a nation together. And that nation, you can call it a form of civic culture that is part of the framework of what a nation is. And that needs to be in place. If you say that you only need to have the courts, then you have an empty system. You always need to be vigilant about the culture, which means that the culture needs to be protected to some degree. Now, the protection doesn't have to be in the way that the M-types want. The ethno-nationalists, they want to protect culture by closing the borders. What we want is to come to a situation that only the people who fit into this culture will be able to come here.
And the way
by natural selection.
Yeah, the way we do that is get rid of the welfare state. So if you can't make it, then you just leave of your own accord.
Now, I think that one way to do this, in fact, would be the following: that to say that in order to be able to live in America as a foreigner, you can't get a single dime in public welfare, not even for public schools. You have to pay for everything. This is what Singapore is doing at the moment. So they're privileging their citizens. There's some rights that apply only to citizens. So they have public schools in Singapore. But if you come there as a foreigner, you cannot go to public school. You can. You have to pay.
We have a system like that for the state colleges and universities in America.
But not for
If you move from one state to another, you have to live there for a year or two or three before you can get what's called in-state tuition, because the idea is that if you've lived in that state your whole life, you've paid taxes and so forth, and so you should get the reduced amount, the regular tuition. Everybody else who moves from out of state has to pay double tuition because they haven't paid into the society, they haven't paid into that state all those
yes.
years. So we do have that, and we ought to view it the same with people coming from outside our borders, for God's
Yes.
sakes.
And it should be even stricter from people who are not even national citizens.
Yeah, they're just coming here to work and not even learning the language or anything. It's pretty insane.
Now, notice that actually having to work is the most integrating action you can do. Because if you have to work, you have to learn the language, you have to integrate into the culture. Now, notice actually, I was sort of using the word to integrate into the culture, but I just want to stress that that type of integration is in fact the same as in DIM. Like when we say that we want people to integrate into our society, and that is precisely what I mean by integration. Not just a conceptual, but that they fit into the context, the forest in the tree, like the culture in the individual, the nation in the individual.
And we don't want them to misintegrate by coming and joining some cult and helping to ruin our society.
Or remaining Mexican.
Or disintegrate by coming and not being a part of society and breaking our culture apart. We want them to integrate into the culture. Good way of looking at it, yeah.
So once you start looking at it through these glasses, I think that most reasonable objectivists will at least say, hey, there's some interesting thoughts there. Let's discuss this. So I think that this could be the start of some kind of conversation in the objectivist community.
I think so. Now I used to be free trade and generally open borders. You used to be free trade. You were saying the tariffs. You were like, tariffs? What's this? So you and I have made some movements over the past several months or something like this.
Yes, but I'm stressing here that I do it. I recognize that these libertarian board libertarian dudes who became like alt-right, they went from D2 to M2, right? So they completely jumped, started hyper integrating things about Jews and crazy stuff that there's not warranted in actual facts. So they become conspiracy theorists and all of this crap. Yeah. What we're talking about here is integration, which is looks like misintegration if you're in the D mindset. But so when we're talking about tariffs, we're not talking about tariffs on anyone. What I would like is to view it as a form of economic warfare. Yes, it is an economic warfare on our own citizens, indirectly, but it's not a very bad economic warfare. And as long as the tariffs are sufficiently small, you can always buy stuff from local producers, and it doesn't have to be expensive because we have, as part of the context. Now, China understands context. Their context is they want to own everything around China. Our context, or American context, I'm saying our, I'm not American, but I mean the American context is Mexico, South America, Canada, and Western Europe, and the English-speaking world. That is our context. So moving factories doesn't necessarily mean moving factories from China to America. It might mean moving factories from China to Mexico, solving two problems in one go. Because we wanted cheap labor, but we wanted to stay in Mexico. So we're solving the immigration problem in America, and we're solving this exportation of all our industrial capability to an enemy.
Yeah. So why don't we get more factories in Mexico so they don't have to come north for jobs so badly, and let China do whatever China needs to do until they're not communist anymore.
So what I propose is that objectivists should propose politically doing the same thing that China does, but in from a free angle point of view, just like they take over the South China Sea by building islands and say this is now Chinese territory. America should do something similar. They should adopt regions and places like Cancun is almost like an American outpost, but like say to Mexico, we're now going to build a tiny little Mexican Hong Kong in Mexico, and we would like to help you do that, and we're going to pour in all the money you want in there, or there's going to be so much work, it's going to be great. We're going to make Mexico great again, and we're going to do that by exporting what we do best, which is capitalism. So rather than importing cheap labor here, we're going to export the best of American ideas to your country. So you don't have to come here and take crappy jobs here. You can have good jobs in Mexico. And what you give us in return is that all these cheap, crappy stuff that we buy from China right now, we'll buy it from you. So you solve two problems. We kill off economically one enemy that we have, and we help build a neighbor, and we stop all this immigration nonsense.
Build another Hong Kong in Mexico. I like this.
Yes,
not
not just in Mexico, but in Honduras and everywhere, anywhere they want. Mm-hmm. Think of this as the South China Sea. Build these little islands and claim it as American virtual territory, but not in the totalitarian way, but in the in the American way.
Sphere of influence way.
Yes, sphere of influence.
Now, I want to just inform you, we've already done quite a bit of that, and we have South Korea and Japan in our pocket.
Yes, and I love that. We should do everything we can to keep Taiwan.
Mm-hmm, and Taiwan, yeah.
And Singapore, obviously.
Yeah.
But we have only done it with those Arctic cultures, like the Chinese are originally Arctic cultures that are used to long-term thinking. We haven't done it in the tropical countries, like in Mexico and all of these places. And the reason we haven't done it there is because, we've been supporting dictators instead, like doing this Cold War kind of thing. That's crazy stuff. We don't want to do that. Instead of saying, let's support some kind of one guy dictator in Cuba or wherever we're supporting them, or in Chile. Let's say we're going to help you make these tiny islands of America, and yes, they're going to be run by American citizens, like officials who are corruption free. Going to have the best people in the world run the system, so it's really like coming to America, but we're going to respect that this is not America, it's just a sphere of influence. And so, in other words, it's going to be a little tiny micro America in Mexico where people can speak Mexican, and it's under Mexican, technically under Mexican rule, but Mexico treats it as like China treats Hong Kong. At some point in the future, like 99-year plan, it's going to be transferred back to Mexico, something like that.
Yeah, some sort of free trade zones or something like that. Which
yes, and then you can say that if you work there in these free trade zones, and there you build up some kind of, I don't like to use the term social credit, but like use some kind of standing, that you can prove that you are a person of good standing, then this might buy you an immigration ticket into America, should you so desire. So in other words, what happens then is that people don't go to America out of desperation, but they go there to trade. So you have these Mexican cities, and they are working there in these Mexican cities, and say, I want to have connections to America so that we can have this free trade going on between this free trade zone in Mexico and America. And so you have more reciprocal traffic and reciprocal trade between Latin America and the U.S.
Now, every time we build something in Latin America, for example, Argentina was pretty rich. Chile, Pinochet, Venezuela was pretty built up. Every time we build something, it gets seized by a bunch of thugs and destroyed.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We can't do that because
Now, I'm a little suspicious of the Spanish culture in general, because they beat the Muslims in a war, and they had some military ships left over from that, and they used those to sail across the ocean and discover America, and then they brought a bunch of gold back. I mean, they've never been an industrious people ever.
no. And this what we're experiencing. It's not just that, but it's also the tropical peoples who lived in South America, the natives there.
Yeah.
And they were also never industrial people. They were industrious working people, but not industrial.
Well, they
people.
piled up some stones.
No, they did more than that. It was very impressive stonework.
Well, okay, they piled up a lot of very neatly cut stones, and
Yes,
and they
that would,
developed a way of writing in strings, collared strings. That's
so
a nuisance, because we have no idea how to crack that code. We have no idea how to crack that code. So
true. But my point is that culture here plays a significant role. And if you think Aztec culture, like human sacrifice, 100,000 people murdered, like the average rate, what was it, like thousands per day, faster than during the Holocaust? Like that was the Aztec culture, where the priests were like ripping open while they were alive their stomach and pulling out their intestines while they were living alive, and they did this at such a phenomenal, almost industrial rate. So those Aztecs people, those are the ones who are controlling the Mexican government right now. There's no wonder that they are the ancestors of the Aztecs. It's no wonder that they have issues.
they're the ones in control, you say, or you
Yeah,
just mean that the DNA of those people are mixed in?
not the DNA. Like they're
They,
not in control. Like it's a little bit fun. There's Hispanics, like the Spaniards. They are definitely in control, uh, but they're mixed in with the Aztec culture that was from before. So you have this very strange mixture of these culture, Spanish culture and the Aztec culture, and it's very strange, and it's not a very good combination because Spain came in at a time when it didn't have a very good culture, and the Aztecs didn't have a very good culture, and then what you have now as a result, the marriage of those two bad cultures is Mexico.
yeah.
So what I'm saying is that you should not hope for Mexico to become a good place overnight. Culture is extremely sticky. This is why we don't want Mexicans to vote in America, because they're Aztecs and Spanish culturally, right? And they're still like that centuries later, and they will keep on being like that until they, over a long, long period of time, can melt that glacier of dark culture. It's like the ice age, right? Even when the temperature rose, it still took thousands of years to melt that huge glacier, 2 miles of ice.
Well, I hope that when people come to America, they're able to finally see things. It's easier for them to see things from an individual point of view and understand the world better and drop those cultural preconceived notions.
Not if they go to football matches and wave the Mexican flag all the time, and only speak Spanish and only indulge in Spanish culture.
Yeah, that's going to be the
So
problem, is the welfare state that allows them to come here and not feel any pressure to integrate at all.
that's right. So an alternative to that, rather than it's just building a wall, make sure that there's no reason to have a wall. And the reason to do that is to colonize Mexico. And I mean colonize, like culturally. And the way to do that is to do what, like build a Hong Kong and say, now we're learning from past mistakes. Mexican government is not going to get their dirty, filthy hands on this little nice jewel until the rest of Mexico has learned to appreciate this culture.
We've also got the problem with people coming from Cuba, though. I mean, even if we take care of Mexico, they're going to come up from Nicaragua. They're going to come up. So
So
ultimately, I think the main answer is to get rid of the welfare state. So even if
yes,
they come here, they can't get anything. They've got to work.
yes, that's the goal. But right now we have the enemy within the Democratic Party, the communists, who are doing everything they can to destroy America by importing a demographic army of leftist voters, Aztecs, and Spanish cultural heritage people who vote kleptocratic. And this, as long as we have this enemy within, we have to fight on all fronts. So it's not enough just to fight the welfare state. If we're just going to wait for the welfare state to disappear, then we can wait for a long time. We have to fight also in Mexico. Take the fight to Mexico. And I mean fight. I'm talking the cultural fight. This is, I'm not talking about actually going to war to Mexico. This Mexicans will prosper from this. This is good for Mexico, and it's not imperialism because you make a deal with Mexico and Mexicans don't have to move to these cities, right? It's just you can move there inside Mexico if you want to, and all you need to do is to prove that you're not a criminal. And if you're a criminal, you will be thrown into jail and whatever.
Now, how big of a patch of land do we need to build this new Hong Kong in Mexico?
The size of a super airport, which is like 1,000 square kilometers, like 300 square miles, something like that, 500 square miles.
All right, a really big airport type area.
Yes.
All right, I'm seeing Veracruz is a good place to do it. Should it be on the east or the west side of Mexico?
It should have. You should think in terms of having coastal access. That's always good, and should be like having an airport or something like that. And there can be an existing population there. There can be an existing town. Just say we're going to come in there and help and transform this town into America town. Something like, and then you get the Mexican people in that town to agree to this. They have to vote for it if you're taking over an existing town. But if you're starting with empty space, then you don't have to have consent of the locals because there are no locals, right?
Now, what do you think if we went to the upper echelons of the Mexican government and said, let's do this? What do you think their arguments against it would be?
Well, it's the same argument that the Malaysian echelon had against Singapore, which is that Singapore makes Malaysia look bad, right? And Malaysians, like Singapore, skyscrapers, 500 yards across the bridge, people are running around naked in the jungle, right? So people are obviously asking, why can't we do as they do in Singapore? And the Malaysian elites realize that Singapore just makes them look bad. So the way to sell it to the elites is to say that this is the elites' plan.
The elite's plan.
Yeah, like they heard this and they fell for it, and they say, no, this is the way to do it, and we want to do this. So if what you do is you sell it to them, but you will get all the credit for this, that this is a brilliant plan concocted by them, and you'll just pay them all the money that they need in order to be happy about that. And they don't get to actually rule directly. They might have some outposts of Mexico that they can rule whatever way they want and desire, because ultimately they don't want money, they want power. So if they can be recognized as heroes, national heroes in their own country for doing this, that is what they want. And if you can give them that, a status of hero, then you can get them to agree to this.
Well, let's set up a meeting with these guys.
Yeah. But this is why I'm saying this is something that Trump should be in charge of doing.
Yeah.
Like, not necessarily Trump, but he is like the ideal guy. But America, this is like, so if Trump starts doing this in his next term, like if in his next 4 years, that would be brilliant. He shouldn't go to an election, try to get elected on this, I think. But if he does it during his second term, there's only one reason for him for doing this, and that is because he loves America and he cares about Mexico.
And he says he
Who,
loves Mexico.
yes, who would be against this? Like, yes, of course, the communists hate this because it's freedom, right? They hate anything that's liberty. But I mean, of the 92% of America that's normal, who can be against this?
Right. Now, what would they say? What would the Mexicans say about it? That it's too expensive? We just say it's going to be in foreign
No,
investment coming in.
it's paid for by America.
Right. And who in America would pay for it? It would be bank. It would be private investment.
It will be a combination it's a joint venture between the public-private some venture, where the private people put up their money, right? But the government put up their people, the uncorrupt police, the law, the justice systems, the bureaucrats, all the people that you need to actually have a working system. And then you put in token Mexicans in there, so that it has a sense of a feeling of being Mexican. But the whole point is that it's guaranteed by America that this will be a low corruption zone, right? It's not just an economic free zone with low taxes. Who cares about that? Mexico is like that. What you want is not a low tax zone; is a low corruption zone, and that is what the American government puts in there of resources. They ensure that this is going to be a low corruption zone.
Now, is that roughly what you see the British as having done with Hong Kong, providing
Yes,
just a
yes,
backdrop of governance,
yes.
right?
And notice how that Hong Kong was able to do that with British as an official language, but the 98% of the people spoke Chinese.
Right. Yeah.
So it's perfectly possible to have a dual language system in these systems. You're saying the laws are in Spanish and in English, but the legal system, the business language is English, as
Which,
it is in the rest of the world.
which it already is, yeah. Business language
Yes.
is English, so.
Yes. So basically, those who don't speak English will still feel at home. They can still read the signs. They can still follow the laws and all of this, and they can still get approval for opening shops and blah 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 blah, bureaucratic stuff. But at the same time, there's a strong incentive for them to learn English because Trump can put in place, if you do well in the city and you prove that you can speak English well, and that you can actually support yourself in this city, then this can allow you to immigrate to America.
Yeah, that would be good. Like you go to the front of the line for quotas,
Yes,
or something like that.
yes. So this gives us only the best. Then Mexico will be sending us their best.
And we can move factories from China to Mexico. Now, Mexico's got pretty high wages now compared to China, which is why factories were moving over there. So, but maybe
That's
someplace.
changing. You haven't been paying attention. China's wages are very high.
Yeah, yeah. But I was just going to say,
But they
maybe
have slave labor.
Yeah, maybe some place else in South America, though, if not Mexico particularly.
That's the thing you say. In Mexico, they are good at this. In Honduras, they're good at that. In this place, Guatemala, they're good at this. They have different advantages. And who says that you only have to build this in Mexico? You want to. This Trump says, this is our backyard. We're going to build our backyard. It's going to be a nice garden.
Free
Right?
trade zones everywhere.
Yes, but within the framework of national sovereignty, not just for America, but for also for these countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that Mexico remains Mexico.
Right.
Because they have their cultural heritage, even though some of this is very bad. Mexico is not just bad. I mean, they have their cultural identity, and some of that is something that's worth hanging on to.
As much as they want to, it's up to them.
Yes.
Mm.
So I think that, for instance, that Brazil doesn't want the help of America to do this. I think that Bolsonaro is doing this on his own in Brazil. So they don't need the help. But there are many poor countries there that are not as strong and big as Brazil that need the help, especially like Guatemala. Mexico would be an important ally in this respect. Honduras.
Yeah, we already have good friends in Panama and Costa Rica.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is just the way I'm thinking right now. If we can get these all objectivists on the same page, that the way to solve this problem is to start integrating the problem with China as seeing them as an enemy, solving that problem of exporting our industry base to China, exporting it back, not to America, but mostly to Mexico and other satellites to solve our immigration problem.
Yeah, it's
that
very nice
makes
integrated way. Yeah,
because now it's a plan. It's not just a policy. It's not like a 5-year plan, God forbid, but it's still like it's based on reality. It's based on integrating of real issues. Immigration is an issue. Poverty is an issue in Mexico, and we want to have low cost import stuff, but not from China. How do we do that? And China is an issue. So how do we solve all of these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very good. Well, you've never mentioned it to me before, so we should start spreading the word about it. This is very good. We should discuss this this type of thing and the way forward that this looks like. I mean, Hong Kong has spread freedom and made a very good case for free economics, and we could do the same thing times 100. We don't need to do just one or times 20.
We can reclaim the Statue of Liberty as the French intended it. When the French sent us their Statue of Liberty, it was the beacon of light so that the rest of the world could see it. It was not a beacon of light to say that this is where all the immigrants should come.
It was an example to the world.
Yes, it was an example, a beacon of enlightenment, right? And that's what we do now, spread the light. And thereby also solving the problem of immigration, because that's ultimately how to do it. Because immigration is not a problem as long as you're not bringing in barbarians. But if you train them in their own countries to value freedom, look at Hong Kong. They were barbarians. Now they're not. Right? They've learned to appreciate freedom, and they're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for their life. No one in Mexico is doing that because they're still barbaric. Yeah. But they can be potty trained, and that's precisely like this happened in Singapore. It happened in Hong Kong and in Taiwan and in Japan and in South Korea to some extent. Can be done in Latin America. Just don't give the keys to the corrupt Aztec Spanish overlord.
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong definitely shows the way for that. They just they didn't even have a democracy there. You couldn't even vote to corrupt people in if you wanted to.
And that will be the deal here. Now, there was this free state, it's not a free state project, like a city project. It was in Honduras, actually. They wanted to build like these cities in Honduras. I forget the name of that. Basically, that's exactly what we're talking about now. Mm. It's the identical project that it was in Honduras. The only difference I'm talking about here is that now it is part of a war. It's an effort of a war against China.
So there's certainly more urgency to it now than 10 years ago. Everybody
This
thought
is
China was
this
the
is
new
not
capitalism.
it's not just to be nice to Honduras or to the people of Mexico or to or Latin America. It's self-interested national interests. We're solving lots of problems in one go. And we want Mexico and Latin America to be as capitalistic and individualistic as possible, because then they can contribute. Then immigration doesn't actually pose a threat in any way.
All right, well, I'm down.
All right. So I think this is a pretty good time to start. We've been 2 hours. That's 1 hour longer than I promised myself. It was a good conversation.
Yes, this is a very good talk.
We should pick up on this later, but maybe there's going to be some reactions to this in the comments, and we'll see what people say, and maybe there's going to be some, like, maybe we're going to actually get a good talk with James Valiant, or like we both know James. He's a good guy. He can be reasonable, so maybe he's the right guy to talk to. Invite him to talk about this or something like that.
Yeah, certainly, or any other objectivist who wants to discuss these things, because this is definitely, we have to start paying attention to what's going on in the world. We can't just keep dismissing it all as philosophical nonsense or whatever.
Yes.
So, well, now what should we title this video? Because we started out with the dim hypothesis and we ended on China.
No, like I would say dim applied to Ayn Rand, comma, like China.
Okay. Dim applied to Ayn Rand, comma, China.
Yes, because I mean, it really piques your interest. If that doesn't pique your interest, that nothing will, right?
Right. All right, very good. Well, watch for the video. I'll be putting it up.
Okay, very good.
All right,
nice
thank
talking to you.
Nice talking to you. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you support what I do and want more of this stuff to be on YouTube and not behind my paywall, please go patronize me and make it easier for me to spend my time doing these fun discussions and recordings. Thank you, Mr. Cropper. Out.